Okay. So anyway, the first chapter in the book is just kind of basic, some basic terminology, cast of characters, all that sort of stuff. And then in chapter 2, we really get into the heart of the matter. Okay, so chapter 1, introduction. We need good guys, we need bad guys. So our good guys are Alice and Bob. Used to be A and B. That's really boring. Now we have Alice and Bob. Okay, so Alice and Bob are the good guys. Trudy is kind of our universal bad guy. Some books will be really cute and they will have Trudy as the intruder and they will have Eve as the eavesdropper and they come up with all these clever names for different bad guys. We just use Trudy most of the time. Okay, so just Trudy serves as our bad guy for everything. And you can tell, Trudy's the bad guy because she's got a black hat. Okay, so there's your bad guy. Okay, so just to kind of preview, foreshadow some of the important topics in the course, let's just consider a scenario. Okay, Alice and Bob, remember, they're the good guys. So Alice wants to open a bank, and it's going to be online. So we have Alice's online bank, AOB. Okay, so what about the security concerns? What does Alice have to think about from a security perspective? Bob is a customer of the bank. What does he think about? What does he have to do security-wise? Trudy, she's the bad guy, right? She's trying to cause trouble for Alice and Bob. What does she think, or how does she view the security situation for this particular bank? Okay, so let's think about that. The most basic things we need in security are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. CIA, easy to remember, right? CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, okay, so what do we mean by confidentiality? Well, Trudy should not be able to read Bob's information. She should not be able to go to the bank site and determine how much Bob has in his account, right? That's private information. She should not be able to see that. So that process of preventing unauthorized reading of data, we will call that confidentiality. Okay, so that's a first definition. You might even see that on a test. Okay, got a test question already. Confidentiality is we want to prevent unauthorized reading. Okay, got that? We have to be able to do that, right? That's a very basic concept. And we will use cryptography, a lot of cryptography. In fact, almost everything we say in cryptography deals with confidentiality. How do we make it so that people who are not supposed to read this information cannot read this information? Okay, another point is that Trudy must not be able to change Alice and Bob's or Bob's information. So you can make it so that she cannot read it, okay? Maybe she can't read and see actually what Bob's account balance is, but there's still some bits there, right, that represent Bob's account balance. What if she goes in and flips some of those bits? Well, then Bob's account balance would be different than what it's supposed to be, right? So we have to protect the integrity of Bob's information. So we will describe integrity as we want to be able to detect unauthorized writing. So if you write, you make a change to it, and you're not authorized to do that, we want to detect it. Okay, got that? Detect unauthorized writing. So reading, writing. Okay, there is a subtle difference here, right? Why do we say detect here? Here we say prevent. Prevent's a lot better than detect, right? If we could, we would want to prevent unauthorized writing, but it turns out that's really hard. So the best we can really hope for is to just detect it. So we can say, okay, there's something wrong with this data. It looks like the integrity of this data is not good. Okay, it's not satisfied. So let's, don't trust the data, right? Okay, got that? Detect versus prevent. Okay, subtle but important point. And again, we use cryptography for integrity. The funny thing is that integrity is something we virtually always need. We always need integrity. We have to protect the integrity of data. Confidentiality is sort of, sometimes we want that, and sometimes we don't care. Okay, so that's sort of a 50-50 proposition, whether we want confidentiality or not. Integrity, we always need integrity. If the data is not trustworthy, it's useless. The funny thing is that almost everything we say, or 90% at least of what we say in cryptography, is about confidentiality, and only a little bit deals with integrity. And that's because the techniques are kind of the same. So we go through it from a confidentiality perspective, and then we get a few techniques or a few little twists on it to do the integrity part. Okay? Okay. And the last one, availability, is self-explanatory. I mean, if you have an online bank and people can't access their account information, they're not going to, you're not going to have a very popular bank, right? And in some sense, this is kind of a new concern in the sense that before the internet, people didn't really think too much about availability. Hey, come on, there's seats over here. People didn't think too much about availability. I mean, think about it. If you had like say a doctor's office, right? Doctor has your personal medical information there. Before the computer era, that information was like on a 3x5 note card in a filing cabinet, right? So as long as the office doesn't burn down, it's available, right? Well, now that information may be stored on the internet, right? So you go and access your information on the internet. And so now it has to be available in that sense, right? That you can actually get to it on the internet. So that raises a lot more potential attacks for Trudy because she can do these things remotely instead of having to get into the office and burn down the office or steal the filing cabinet or something, right? So very different sort of problem. Anyway, we won't say too much about availability, but it's an interesting problem, all right? And a very important problem. Okay, so again, confidentiality, what's the definition?
Stop people from reading.
Prevent unauthorized reading, right? Okay, integrity.
Tell when people have access to it.
Close.
Detect unauthorized writing.
Detect unauthorized writing. Okay, so reading and writing, and remember prevent versus detect. Okay, that's actually an important distinction. Okay, so that's good. That's basics, right? But of course, that wouldn't be much of a course. That's all we had, so we got to have more than that. Let's think about the actual process. Okay, let's suppose Bob is a customer at Alice's online bank. What's the process that he goes through to access his account, to do some transaction, and so on and so forth? And let's think about what security issues arise at each of those steps. Okay, so Bob wants to go to Alice's online bank where he has an account, right? What's the first thing he has to do? First thing he has to do is to log into his computer, right? Comes up to his computer and says, hey, I'm Bob. And Bob's computer says, prove it. You got to prove to me that you're Bob. I don't trust anybody. And so how do you do that? You typically do that with a password, or maybe you use a photo ID or something, but it's just passwords are very common. So you have to verify using a password, and there's some cryptography involved there. Okay, so we will see some clever cryptography is involved in password verification. And there's a lot of security concerns with passwords, so we'll discuss those. And what are the alternatives to passwords? Things like biometrics and having your phone in possession and stuff like that. Okay, so cryptography comes in at that step. Okay, so Bob logs into his computer. Now he's got access to his computer. What's the next step? Well, it's an online bank. What do you have to do? You have to point your browser to Alice's online bank, right? Okay, so he enters the URL or whatever for Alice's online bank. And what does the online bank say? Well, it wants to be sure this is really Bob, right? You can't just let anybody access Bob's information. So it's the same problem. You have to authenticate. You have to convince the computer that you're really Bob. Well, we just did that, right? Just did that on the standalone computer. Now we're doing this to Alice's online bank, so it should be the same problem, right? Well, actually not. Actually, it's a completely different problem. What's different here? The difference is that we're now going over a network. We're sending this information over a network instead of doing this locally, right? You might not think that makes much of a difference, but it actually becomes a completely different problem. Now it's all about security protocols. We have to have a protocol that sends these messages and does this in a secure way so that, Trudy can't disrupt these messages. Trudy can't authenticate because she's on the network too, right? Trudy can't break that authentication, and Bob can verify, or Alice's bank can verify the authentication. All kinds of issues come up that you don't think about or don't typically occur if you're on your standalone computer, okay? So this brings up the issues of network security, right? So how do we make these transactions that happen, or this authentication that happens over the network, how do we make that secure? And that, again, all comes down to security protocols. Now, if you've had a networking class, that's great. Can I just ask, how many people here have had a networking class? Say 158A, something like that? 3 or 4. That's typical. Yeah. That's good. But if you haven't, that's not a problem. We cover all the basics that you need to know. And we have a whole chapter on network basics. Okay. So, and even if you have had the class, you need to pay attention because we may have a little different terminology or a little different look at it. But I actually highly recommend you take a networking class. When I first started here, that was by far the most popular elective was networking. Now nobody takes it. I don't know why. Anyway, it's a good class. Okay, so anyway, protocols, that all comes down to protocols. So we will talk about network security kind of in general, but mostly, probably 90% of that is focused on security protocols, okay? All right. And I should mention that cryptography plays a huge role in protocols, okay? So that's sort of, you can really look at that as applied cryptography. That's where you're applying the cryptography most directly that we learn in the first section of this course. Cryptography is hard, okay? But, if you don't get that stuff figured out, you're not going to do well in the next section or the third section where we cover protocols because it comes up there. Okay? It's an important part of protocols. Okay, now what? Now Bob points his browser to Alice's online bank. All that protocol magic happens, and now he's authenticated, right? So he's got access to his account. Okay, now he's got access to his account, but there's certain things he cannot do on Alice's online bank. He can't see Charlie's account balance, for example, right? It's there, but he can't see it, or he's not supposed to be able to see it. He can't install new software on the server, okay? All kinds of things, all kinds of restrictions on what Bob is allowed to do once he's got access to this, to Alice's online bank. These restrictions are known as authorization. Okay, what are you authorized to do once you have access? Okay, once you get access, what are you authorized to do? Authorization. Now, for our purposes in this book, I will define access control to be authorization and authentication. Those two things together, okay? Two parts. Now, a lot of books, especially older books, they will use access control as a synonym for authorization. So you need to be a little careful if you're looking at older books. They may not use this terminology quite the same, okay? They're wrong and I'm right because it's my book and it's my class, okay? So, yeah. Okay, so now Bob has access to his account. He can only see stuff in his accounts, not everybody else's. All that stuff's working. He can transfer funds between his accounts or whatever he wants to do, okay? So that's all good. But there's a kind of a potential lurking problem here. Let's suppose that the cryptography, the access control, the protocols, all that stuff we talked about so far is perfect. Okay, the cryptography nobody can break. It's just great. It's wonderful. The protocols, the security protocols, are done exactly right, and they're bulletproof. Nobody can break those. And the access control is all done correctly. Okay, let's suppose that's the case. Well, there's still a potential problem, and that problem is that all of this stuff we talked about, the protocols, the cryptography, the access control stuff, that's all built in software, right? You have to write code to implement these things, right? They're all done on computers, so it's all software. Software itself is a potential vulnerability. Okay, in fact, it's a huge potential vulnerability. It's sort of, you can think of it as the foundation on which all of your security rests, right? You build it all on top of this software. And if someone can directly attack the software, they can break your security no matter how good the structure above it is. And we get kind of pressed for time at the end. That's sort of our last section is software. So we don't spend a lot of time on software, but I think we spend enough that you'll see there's some real potential problems there. All right. Okay, so a lot of issues with software come up because of flaws. So you write code to do anything very sophisticated today can be huge. I mean, it can be literally millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of lines of code. No one person can sit there and look at a million lines of code and make sense of it, right? So what happens is that bugs and flaws get into code. I know it's a shock, right? There are bugs in code, right? So bugs get inserted into code. So mistakes get made, right? So there are mistakes while you are coding. Those mistakes, well, what are mistakes in codes? Well, one way to look at it is that a flaw in code could be viewed as an unintended feature, right? Okay, it does something, right? It's not supposed to do. It's an unintended feature. If your software is security critical and it has unintended features, some of those unintended features are going to break the security, okay? Well, this is great for Trudy. If Trudy can find just one of those flaws that breaks your security, she wins. And you, as the good guy, you got to find them all. Oh, it's so unfair. Okay, so you got to find them all to prevent it. She's only got to find one. Okay, and we'll see this sort of asymmetry come up several times in security. Trudy has all of the advantages, and that's why security is such a hard problem. One of the reasons. Okay, so you have that people. There's flaws in software, and there are other ways to directly attack software, and Trudy will, of course, do those things because that's what she does. And what about malware? Okay, malware is a whole nother ball of wax, right? That's something that somebody purposely wrote the software to do bad things, right? And malware is kind of a special interest of mine, so we will have a lot of discussion of malware, right? Okay, so the textbook. We cover 4 major topics. Those 4 major topics are cryptography, access control, and I'll probably just shorthand as protocols, but it's really network security / protocols, and software. We focus on the technical issues. We're technical people, right? That's what you do in computer science. You look at technical issues. But people are also involved here in security, right? Okay, people can break security, either intentionally, like Trudy, or unintentionally. They're trying to do the right thing, but they make a mistake, right? So again, this is the focus of the course, technical issues, but just as an aside here, let's think about the people problem for a minute, all right? So again, people can break security. It can be either intentional, we write malware, right? You're trying to break security, or it can be unintentional. And let's look at one of these unintentional examples, all right? Let's suppose you've heard wonderful things about this book and you want to buy it. So you go to Amazon.com and you point your browser at Amazon and do whatever you have to do. All the authentication or whatever happens. Okay, so when you go to Amazon, they will use the SSL protocol, Secure Socket Layer Protocol, or something equivalent. Okay, so there's a security protocol involved when you go to Amazon, right? Because, there has to be, right? You have to authenticate, and you have to convince them you're actually you. You have to send credit card information, right? You have to protect the confidentiality of that. You don't want people reading your credit card information, right? They could steal your credit card. You have to protect the integrity of the message. You don't want to order, just one copy when you meant to order 10, right? So you want that integrity protected, and so on and so forth. All those mechanisms, and they're all written in software and so on. Well, let's suppose all that stuff's perfect. Even the software, everything's working flawlessly, just as it should, all right? So you'd be safe, right? Well, not exactly, okay? Because we'll look at the details of this in a later chapter, but there's a man-in-the-middle attack. So when you send something over the network, right, we assume that Trudy can see those messages. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother with security, right? So Trudy's sitting here somewhere in the middle, and she can see the messages going back and forth. And she can insert messages. She can delete messages. She can do lots of things as this man-in-the-middle sort of attacker, all right? And there's a very specific thing she can do, okay? So she does this very specific attack. Well, the SSL protocol is not stupid, it's smart, right? And it realizes there's something wrong in the protocol. Okay, Trudy's messing around. There's something wrong here. Okay, so what should the protocol do? Well, ideally it should just end the connection, right? Something wrong here. But the fact is, a lot of times people don't have valid certificates or whatever, and this sort of situation comes up a lot. And if you just end the protocol, people get mad, right? And they stop using it, right? Because, hey, I was doing the right thing and it just quit working. So what they do in the SSL protocol is they they ask you, do you want to continue or not? They say, okay, the protocol has discovered something's not quite kosher here. Do you want to continue or not? And what do you say?
Yeah.
Of course you want to continue. Yeah, how do I turn off this annoying security stuff? It's really bugging me, right? Yeah, so of course you continue. And as soon as you continue, you've opened the door to that man in the middle attack. All right? And so, it's unintentional. You didn't intend to break the security, but maybe you didn't understand the details, didn't understand the potential magnitude here of what you're doing. And you just say, okay, and you open the door to that attack. Now, I'm not saying every time you get this error message in SSL, because it does come up a lot, somebody's doing a man-in-the-middle attack, but they could be. It could be happening, and you would just be okay that attack. Okay, so that's an unintentional case. Again, we'll look at the details of that. Okay, so I want to go through very briefly the 4 major areas in this book, and basically it's chapter by chapter. I'll go through here. So cryptography, you can think of as secret codes. Okay, how do you protect the confidentiality of your messages? And there's 4 chapters here. Classic cryptography, which is like pencil and paper kind of systems, right? So, like something you'd see in the newspaper where you do a puzzle and trying to solve it. Do they have newspapers anymore? I don't know. Well, anyway, some kind of puzzle that you're trying to solve, and things you do by hand. Now, you might ask why we do that. The reason we do that is because, it's fun. No, because it's not just fun in games, okay? It's those very same principles you see in these very simple ciphers show up in real-world ciphers. Okay, symmetric ciphers that we will talk about, the real world ciphers. The principles are there. The fundamental principles are there in much simpler systems. So we start with the very simple classic ciphers. Okay, and each of the classic ciphers we talk about illustrate an important point that we will see in the real world ciphers. Okay, amongst the real world ciphers, we cover symmetric ciphers and public key cryptography. Now, symmetric ciphers, the symmetry here means that the sender and receiver do essentially the same thing, okay? So it's essentially the same in both directions. Public key cryptography, so let's back up here. So in symmetric key cryptography, there's a key. What's the key? The key is the thing you keep secret, okay? If you know the key, then you can decrypt the message. If you know the key, you can encrypt the message, right? And that key is only shared between Alice and Bob, so that they can send messages back and forth, and Trudy cannot read them because she doesn't have the key. Okay, so got it? Key. All right. Now, public key cryptography. So people have literally been doing symmetric key cryptography for thousands of years. It's been around forever, right? Public key cryptography is about 50 years old. People didn't even know about it till 50 years. They didn't realize you could do this. What is different in public key cryptography is that there's 2 keys. There's not just one key that Alice and Bob share. There's 2 keys, one to encrypt and one to decrypt. Big deal, 2 keys. What's the difference? Well, it's kind of an amazing difference, okay? If you have 2 keys, one that encrypts and one that decrypts, you can take the encryption key and you can make it public. I can have a public-private key pair, two keys, right? One that encrypts, one that decrypts, for me, and I can take the encryption key and I can put it on my website. Everybody can use that key and encrypt messages and send them to me, and I'm the only one who can read them because I'm the only one who has the decryption key. You can't do that with a symmetric cipher, right? Because the same key is used to encrypt as to decrypt. Put the key on your website, anybody encrypts, anybody can decrypt, right? So it doesn't work. Okay, so it's pretty amazing that you can do this. You can have 2 different keys, and nobody ever thought about it until like the 1970s, right? Okay, and so that's pretty amazing, and it actually turns out to be extremely useful in protocols, all right? This is a little bit tricky because symmetric ciphers, there's sort of almost cookbook ways to create symmetric ciphers. So there's lots of symmetric ciphers out there. Not all are really strong, but there's a lot of them out there. Public key systems, they're very tricky to construct, and that's why people didn't know about these for so long. They're very special, okay? And so we will talk about the popular public key systems, and you'll see that there's, it's subtle. You have to do things correctly to make those work. Okay, and finally, hash functions. It's kind of similar to what you might have talked about for hashing in other classes, but it's cryptographic hashing, and cryptographers have very stringent requirements. So these are like super duper hash functions, okay? And if we can create these hash functions, we can do all kinds of amazing stuff. Things like Bitcoin would be impossible without cryptographic hash functions. Okay, so they lead to all kinds of really cool applications just because you have these very strong sort of hash functions. Okay, and the plus plus just means there's a few other topics here that didn't really fit in anywhere else. They're kind of cryptography related, so I put them in this last chapter because it wasn't worth a whole another chapter. Okay, so cryptography. Access control, there's 2 chapters, authentication and authorization. Authentication refers to on the standalone computer where you come up and type in your password. You know, it says Mark Stamp, it says prove it, type in my password, all that. We'll also look at biometrics and other related forms of authentication. All right. Authorization, this is probably a little bit, this again is once you've got access to a computing resource, what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? That's authorization. And this is a little different than most of the topics. It's a little, maybe a little less concrete than some of the other topics. So it's a little, maybe slightly more abstract, not really abstract, but just slightly less concrete than some of the other topics. But I think it's still important. Historically, it's very important, and it still is important that we do these things right. At least you have some idea as to what's going on in that area. But we don't go too deep into that topic. Then we get to network security or security protocols, and this again is a pretty challenging topic. So we do talk about network basics. We have a whole chapter on network basics, but the emphasis is on security issues, right? It's a security class, right? So we go through just kind of generic networking issues and what security things come up at each of these different layers of the protocol stack and things like that. Then we look at a chapter on, I don't ever know what word to put here. Simple's not quite right. We look at sort of scaled down or simplified security protocols. Our goal here really is to get to these real world security protocols, things like SSL and IPsec and so on. But if we dive right into those, there's a lot of bookkeeping and things like that has to happen in a real world protocol. And so it's easy to lose sight of the security issues. So we strip all that stuff out and we look at some authentication protocols that are simplified, all right? So we just focus on the security issues. How do we authenticate? How do we establish a key that we can use? You know, how do we do some of these other fancier things we might want to do in a protocol? Okay, so we strip out all that extraneous stuff. And then once we have that background, then we can look at the real world protocols in detail. Now, we don't cover every detail of every protocol. We just can't do that. I mean, the SSL specification is like 100 pages, right? We can't do every case. So we do simplify them a little bit, but the basics are all there. Okay, so you'll see how these protocols actually work. Okay. Finally, software. By this point, we're usually running short of time, so we don't have a lot of extra time here. So this is an interesting and important area. There's a chapter here where we go over buffer overflow attacks and things like that. But defenses today are very good against buffer overflow attacks. They're not very common anymore. They used to be hugely common and cause most of the problems, software-related problems. But since they're not so common, we will probably skip that. Okay, so we just don't have time for everything. We will discuss malware. That's really an interesting topic. Most of my master's students do projects related to malware. We do a lot of machine learning, deep learning that we apply to malware. So I will hopefully have time for at least a couple lectures on that. So a lot of stuff on malware. And then we finish with reverse engineering. Okay, so this is not really a hacker sort of class. You're not going to be hacking things and stuff like that. until we get to this chapter. Reverse engineering just means you have some software. Maybe it has like a serial number check or something like that, and you're too cheap to pay for the serial number. So how can you bypass that serial number check? Well, I mean, you have the code right there, right? You can break down the code and you can figure out where it's checking to see if that serial number was entered correctly, and you can just bypass it, right? So things like that. So you'll actually have to reverse engineer some software to bypass serial numbers and do various things like that, all right? Okay, and that sort of shows you just how vulnerable software is. If you give a person software on their computer, they have access to all the bits, they can make it do whatever they want it to do. It might be a little tedious, might be some work, but they can bypass your security that you built into it. Okay, so I think that's important, and it's kind of a fun place to end. Okay, so any questions on that? 4 topics: cryptography, access control, protocols, software. Okay, you guys are easy. Okay, so in this course, we try to think like Trudy. Okay, so we put ourselves sort of in the role of the bad guy, right? We're trying to expose flaws or figure out where the security vulnerabilities are before Trudy finds them, right? So we put ourselves in that same role of trying to attack the system. We're looking for the weakest link. Systems are involved. There's a lot of different parts, moving parts to this system. If the cryptography is just bulletproof, we can't break that cryptography. People have been looking at this system for 100 years and nobody's broken it. Okay, don't look there. Okay, look for some other where it interfaces, where the software comes into play or something like that. Look for some other attack on this system. Look for the weakest point. Okay, and that's the way Trudy would work. So that's the way we have to think about the problem. And it's kind of funny, not that long ago, right? I mean, I wrote the first edition of this book in like 2006. I guess that's a long time ago. But about that time, or even later than, you have a question back there? Question?
Oh, just asking where the slides
are. Oh, okay, got it. Okay. Okay, so maybe 2010, that sort of time frame. People, there was a lot of debate as to whether you should be teaching things, things that Trudy does, whether you should be teaching those things in class. I remember the guy who had the first class on malware analysis, right? This guy at University of Calgary, we had him down here and he gave a talk one time. Very interesting guy. But anyway, he set up a lab. He had to set up a lab in order to let students touch malware, right? He had to set up a lab. That lab had to be isolated from the internet. They had to come in through a door, be searched, they couldn't take anything out on a floppy disk or whatever was used at the time, It was like, high security just to even look at a virus, a computer virus. Now you can go to virus share, right? And there's millions of viruses, sample viruses out there that you can download and you can experiment with. Okay, so it's a complete change of paradigm here. At one point, it was considered bad. You shouldn't be teaching this stuff. Trudy would do, because you're just teaching people how to break things. But in fact, that's kind of silly, right? Because you have to understand how Trudy is breaking things in order to defend against those attacks. So now that's the way people think. Hey, it's good to get this information out. And things like malware, software reverse engineering, those are kind of the epitome, of kind of Trudy breaking things. Okay, so anyway, think like the bad guy. It's kind of like a police detective, right? You put yourself in the role of the bad guy, right? Now, we want to understand Trudy's methods. We want to know how she works, what she's doing, what did she do to break this particular system, right? That's important. We might think about her motives. Sometimes that's important. For most of what we do, it's not that critical. We're just trying to break stuff, right? We can pretend to be Trudy. We'll put ourselves in that position. We will try to attack this system. Okay, that's very legit. So you think like Trudy, study Trudy's methods, and sometimes Alice and Bob do things, that are really stupid and make Trudy's job easier. We can laugh at that, okay? But we don't act like Trudy. Maybe in class we do, but not in the real world, okay? And even in class, there might be some limits here. So again, think like the bad guy. Always look for that weakness, the weak link. Where can you find the flaw in this particular system? You can break the rules in class within limits. All right. We think like Trudy, but don't do anything stupid or illegal. Okay? Don't do something illegal and say, hey, my professor said that was okay. Because I said it's not. It's here on video. I said it's not okay to do that. All right. Okay. So any questions?